Have you ever walked into a room decked out in white orchids, the one flower you are allergic to, and realized the party was never for you? My mother, wearing a blood-red dress, raised her glass not to toast my 28th birthday, but to publicly execute my reputation before 200 guests. She thought stripping me of my inheritance would break me, but she forgot one thing. Tonight, I did not bring tears. I brought bank statements that will burn her empire to ash. My name is Tessa Bracken, and as I steered my battered 10-year-old Honda Civic toward the valet stand of the Gilded Cage, I felt less like a birthday girl and more like an inmate returning to the scene of a crime. The hotel loomed ahead, a monstrosity of gold leaf and marble that looked less like a place of hospitality and more like a mausoleum for the living. The valet, a young man who looked like he had been bred in a laboratory for sneering, eyed my car with open disdain. The engine sputtered a final, dying cough as I killed the ignition. A stark contrast to the purr of the sleek black limousine idling ahead of me. I tossed him the keys, ignoring the way he held them between two fingers as if they were contaminated. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. It was a simple navy sheath I had bought off the rack at a department store clearance sale, costing me exactly $45. It was elegant enough for the real world. But in the world of Richard and Victoria Bracken, it was tantamount to wearing a burlap sack. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive exhaust fumes and impending doom. It had been 3 years since I had set foot in a Bracken family event. 3 years of blessed silence. 3 years of earning my own paycheck at Veritas Audit Solutions, the one firm my father despised more than the IRS. Walking through the revolving doors, the air conditioning hit me like a physical slap. The lobby of the Gilded Cage was aggressively opulent. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a fracture of light that made my eyes ache. I navigated through the labyrinth of marble pillars toward the grand ballroom, my heels clicking a lonely rhythm on the polished floor. I paused at the entrance, my hand hovering over the heavy mahogany door. I told myself I could do this. I just needed to survive 2 hours. 120 minutes. That was the deal. Show up. Smile for the cameras. Pretend we were a happy, functional dynasty, and in exchange, my father would sign over the trust fund my grandmother had left for my education money they had withheld the moment I chose an accounting degree over a Mrs. degree. It was $50,000, not a fortune to them. Barely a rounding error in the Bracken Holdings ledger, but to me, it was freedom. It was a down payment on a condo where the heating actually worked. It was a life without debt. I pushed the doors open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a cloying, suffocating scent of white orchids. My throat tightened instinctively. I was severely allergic to orchids. My mother knew this. In fact, she was the only person on earth who knew exactly how quickly my airways would close up if I got too close. And yet, the ballroom was a veritable jungle of them. Tall, weeping centerpieces on every table, garlands draped across the stage, massive bouquets flanking the entrance. It was not a decoration choice, it was a biological weapon. I held my breath and stepped inside, scanning the room. The theme of the party seemed to be aggressive ivory. Everything was white, cream, or gold. It was the specific shade of sterile perfection that I loathed. But it was the crowd that made my stomach churn. There were 200 people in the room, and I did not see a single friend, not one. There was no Sarah from my yoga class, no Mike from the office. Instead, the room was populated by the sharks of the city's financial district, men in $3,000 suits who smelled of scotch and insider trading, and women whose faces were pulled so tight by surgery they looked permanently surprised. These were my parents' business partners, their investors, their rivals, and their sycophants. Tessa, darling. The voice grated on my nerves like sandpaper. I turned to see Aunt Carla gliding toward me. She was holding a martini glass with the precarious balance of a functioning alcoholic. Carla was my mother's younger sister and had made a career out of being the family's designated spy. Aunt Carla, I said, forcing the corners of my mouth upward. You look vibrant. And you look sturdy, she said. her eyes raking over my clearance rack dress. She leaned in, wrapping me in a cloud of expensive perfume and gin. "We were betting you wouldn't show, given the circumstances." "It is my birthday," I said, stepping back to avoid contact with a stray orchid petal on her lapel. "Why wouldn't I show?" Carla's eyes glittered with malice. "Oh, you are brave. I will give you that. Or just incredibly thick-skinned. I suppose working for those auditors has toughened you up. How is that going, by the way?" "Still digging through other people's trash for a living. I am a forensic accountant. Carla, we find fraud. We don't dig through trash unless that is where the receipts are." "Potato, potato," she waved a hand dismissively. "Just try not to embarrass your mother tonight. She has worked very hard on this little charade." She drifted away before I could respond, leaving me unsettled. Given the circumstances, what circumstances I had been estranged. Yes, but that was old news. I moved deeper into the room, searching for a waiter with water. I needed to wash the taste of anxiety out of my mouth. I passed a buffet table and stopped dead. The menu was displayed on a gold-embossed card. Appetizer, pan-seared scallops with truffle oil. Entree lobster thermidor. Dessert pistachio macarons. I stared at the card, feeling a cold laugh bubbling in my chest. I was allergic to shellfish, deadly allergic to pistachios. The entire menu was a minefield. If I ate anything here, I would end the night in an ambulance. It was a power move, subtle and vicious. It said, "You do not belong at this table. You cannot even sustain yourself here." "Hungry? 'Cause—" I stiffened. Jason, my cousin, the golden boy, the heir apparent to the Bracken throne since I had abdicated by having a conscience. He was leaning against a pillar, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He looked every inch the corporate raider. Slicked back hair, and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Not particularly," I said. "I see they catered to my specific lack of dietary requirements." Jason chuckled. A low, what sound. "Aunt Victoria wanted the best. You know how she is. She forgets the little details. My ability to breathe is hardly a little detail. Jason." He pushed off the pillar and walked a circle around me, inspecting me like livestock. "You know, you could have just signed the papers. Tessa, the restructuring deal. Dad said you were being difficult, said you were flagging transactions that were perfectly standard. Transferring $3 million to a shell company in the Cayman Islands marked as consulting fees is not standard. Jason, it is money laundering. It is creative accounting," he corrected, his voice dropping to a hiss. "But that is why you are on the outside looking in. You lack vision. You always have. You think the world runs on rules, the world runs on leverage, and right now, you have none." "I have my dignity," I said, sounding more confident than I felt. "Dignity does not pay the rent on that shoebox apartment of yours," he sneered. Then his expression shifted. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something worse. It was amusement. "Enjoy the show tonight, Tessa. Really, soak it up." He walked away, leaving me standing alone near the shrimp tower. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. People were looking at me. Not just looking, staring. I saw heads leaning together, hands covering mouths. A group of bankers near the bar glanced my way, then erupted into laughter. When I made eye contact, they didn't look away. They just smirked with a predatory glint. It felt like walking into a high school cafeteria after a rumor had decimated your reputation. But these were grown adults with net worths in the 8 figures. Just 2 hours. I repeated the mantra in my head. Get the check, leave, never come back. Then, the lighting in the room shifted. The ambient warm glow dimmed, and a dramatic white spotlight cut through the darkness, hitting the double doors at the far end of the ballroom. The doors swung open. My parents had arrived. Richard and Victoria Bracken did not walk. They processed. My father looked impeccable in a tuxedo that cost more than my car. His face a mask of iron determination. But it was my mother who commanded the room. She was wearing a gown of blood-red silk that trailed behind her like a pool of spilled wine. It was a violent splash of color in the white room. She looked stunning. She looked terrifying. Applause rippled through the room, polite at first, then growing in intensity as they descended the grand staircase. They waved, they smiled, they shook hands with the senator in the front row. They played the part of the benevolent monarchs to perfection. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, waiting for them to spot me, waiting for the cursory nod, the fake air kiss that would signal to the room that despite our differences, I was still blood. My father's eyes swept the room. They landed on me. For a second, time seemed to dilate. I expected annoyance. I expected disappointment. Those were the emotions I was used to. But I saw neither. His eyes were flat, dead voids. He looked at me the way a surgeon looks at a gangrenous limb before the amputation without hate. Just with a cold calculation of necessity, he looked right through me and turned to whisper something to my mother. She didn't even look at me. She kept her chin high, her smile fixed, refusing to acknowledge my existence. A maitre d' materialized at my elbow, making me jump. He was a small man with a face like a ferret. "Miss Bracken," he whispered. "Yes." "Your seat is this way." I frowned. "I'm not sitting with my parents." Usually, at these charades, they wanted me at the head table to keep up appearances. "No, miss, follow me, please." He led me away from the head table, away from the VIP section. He walked me right to the dead center of the room. There, surrounded by empty space, was a single small round table. It was set for one. The placement was aggressive. It was not tucked away in a corner where an embarrassing relative might be hidden. It was exposed. It was directly in front of the stage where my parents would be sitting. It was under the harshest light of the chandelier. "Here," I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Mrs. Bracken insisted," the maitre d' said. Pulling out the chair, I sat down. The moment I did, I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me. I was not a guest of honor. I was not even a guest. I looked around at the sea of faces, Jason smirking behind his champagne flute, Aunt Carla whispering frantically to a neighbor, the business partners staring with morbid curiosity. The layout was unmistakable. The head table was the judge's bench. The guests were the jury. And I, sitting alone in the middle of the room with my empty plate and my allergy-inducing centerpiece, was the defendant. My stomach dropped. The unease that had been nagging me all night solidified into cold, hard dread. They were not going to give me the money. They had not invited me here to make peace. They had invited me here to make an example. The music swelled, a triumphant orchestral piece that signaled the beginning of the formal proceedings. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to grab my purse and sprint for the exit. But I couldn't move. I was frozen by the sheer audacity of it. "What are you doing?" Mother, I thought, watching her take her seat on the stage, her red dress arranging itself around her like a pool of blood. She caught my eye then, for the first time, and she smiled. It wasn't a mother's smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just heard the cage door click shut. The orchestral music did not fade away. It was severed. One moment, the room was filled with the polite, high society swelling of violins and cellos, and the next, there was a vacuum of sound so absolute it felt violent. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air in a submarine moments before the hull breaches. The chatter of 200 guests died instantly. Conditioned as they were to recognize when the masters of the house demanded attention, my mother, Victoria, stepped up to the microphone stand in the center of the stage. The spotlight followed her, turning her red silk dress into a column of fire. She looked magnificent and terrifying. A deity of vengeance descended to earth. She adjusted the microphone with a manicured hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light and sending fractures of brilliance across the room. She scanned the crowd, her gaze lingering on the most important investors, the wealthiest bankers, the most influential gossips, Then, finally, her eyes flicked to me. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. I saw the cold, reptilian satisfaction of a predator who has cornered its prey in an open field. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the look vanished. Her face softened into a mask of tragic beauty. Her shoulders slumped slightly, a calculated posture of burden and sorrow. "My dear friends," she began, her voice trembling with a perfect, practiced vibrato. "My cherished partners, thank you for being here tonight. You all know why the invitation said we were celebrating the 28th birthday of our daughter, Tessa." She paused. The room leaned in. I gripped the tablecloth, my knuckles turning white. Something was wrong. The tone was wrong. This was not the speech of a mother welcoming a prodigal daughter back into the fold. This was an elegy. "But," she continued, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade, "Richard and I have realized that we can no longer live a lie. We can no longer pretend that everything is well within the house of Bracken. As parents, our instinct is to protect our children, even when they stray, even when they hurt us. But there comes a time when protection becomes enabling. There comes a time when silence becomes complicity." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My breath hitched. I looked around, desperate for eye contact, for someone to acknowledge the insanity of this. But every face was turned toward the stage, rapt. This was not a birthday party. This was a piece of theater. And I was the prop. My father, Richard, stepped forward from the shadows behind her. He did not look at me. He moved with the grim determination of an executioner. In his hand, he held a small remote control. He pointed it at the massive projection screen that had descended behind them, the screen I had assumed would display embarrassing baby photos, or perhaps a montage of family vacations from before the war started. "We wanted to remember the good times," my father said, his voice booming through the speakers, deep and grave. "But Tessa has made that impossible." He pressed the button. A giant image flashed onto the screen. It was grainy, clearly taken with a long-range lens, perhaps by a private investigator. In the photo, I was sitting on a park bench, my head in my hands, looking disheveled, with red puffy eyes. I remembered that day. It was 6 months ago. I had just come from a therapy session where I had finally admitted aloud that my parents' emotional abuse had given me chronic anxiety. I had sat on that bench to weep before driving home, but the caption underneath the photo, typed in a stark, accusatory font, did not say Tessa crying after therapy. It read, "Incident 4, Public Intoxication Following Narcotics Abuse." A collective gasp ripped through the room. It was a physical sound, a wave of shock that hit me in the chest. "No," I whispered, the word dying in my dry throat. "That is a lie." My mother's voice rose over the murmur, sorrowful and loud. "We have tried," she said, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. "God knows we have tried. We have paid for the best rehabilitation centers in Switzerland. We have covered up the incidents. We have bailed her out of jails in 3 different states. We thought if we loved her enough, if we supported her enough, she would come back to us." Lies. I tried to shout, but my voice was thin. Swallowed by the cavernous room, I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I have never been to rehab. I have never been to jail." No one listened. They were looking at the screen. Richard clicked the remote again. The next slide showed a photocopy of a document. It was a heavily redacted email with the Veritas Audit Solutions logo at the top. It was an email I had sent to my boss, flagging a discrepancy in the Bracken Holdings tax returns. I had been doing my job. I had been ethical. The caption read, "Corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets sold to competitors." "She did not just break our hearts," my father said, his voice hardening into righteous anger. "She betrayed this family. She betrayed the company that put food on her table for 28 years. We discovered 3 months ago that Tessa has been stealing confidential client lists and selling them to rival firms to fund her lifestyle." The murmurs in the room turned angry. These people were business owners. To them, Corporate theft was a sin far worse than drug addiction. I saw the faces around me harden. The pity was gone, replaced by disgust. "She is a forensic accountant," I screamed, my voice finally finding its footing, though it shook with rage. "I was auditing you. I found the fraud." "Security," my father said calmly into the microphone, not even glancing at me. "Please ensure she does not cause a scene. We want to finish this with dignity." Two large men in black suits stepped out of the shadows near the walls and moved toward my table. They did not touch me, but they stood close enough to form a wall, blocking my path to the stage, boxing me in. I was trapped in my spotlight, a prisoner in a cage of light. My mother took a step forward, reclaiming the center stage. She looked down at me, and for the first time, she addressed me directly, but she did not speak to me. She spoke to the version of me she had created for this audience. "Tessa," she said, her voice dripping with disappointed love. "We forgave the drugs, we forgave the stealing, but we cannot forgive the moral decay." She nodded to Richard. He clicked the remote one last time. The image that appeared was a blur of limbs and sheets. It was a photo so doctored, so obviously manipulated to anyone who knew me, that it was laughable, but to these people, it looked like a scandalous, illicit tryst. "We found out last week," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a scandalized whisper that the microphone amplified to every corner of the room, "that she has been engaging in affairs with married partners of our firm, blackmailing them for silence." The room exploded. The shock was electric. I saw hands reaching into pockets and purses. Phones were coming out, not one or two, but dozens. The little red recording lights blinked on like hundreds of demonic eyes in the darkness. They were live streaming. They were recording. My destruction was being broadcast in real time to the world. I felt the blood drain from my face. My legs felt numb. This was not just an embarrassment. This was an annihilation. They were systematically dismantling every aspect of my life, my mental health, my professional integrity, and my moral character. They were ensuring that no reputable firm would ever hire me, that no bank would ever loan to me, and that no decent person would ever associate with me. They were murdering Tessa Bracken. The music had stopped, the waiters had frozen, and the air in the room was so thick with judgment it felt hard to breathe. I looked at Jason, standing near the bar. He was holding his phone up, recording me, a wide, triumphant grin plastered on his face. He mouthed two words to me: "Game over." My mother took a deep breath, preparing for the coup de grace. She looked at the crowd, her eyes shining with the brilliance of unshed tears. "We have no choice," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "We have a duty to our shareholders, to our ancestors, and to the name Bracken. We cannot allow this cancer to spread any further." She gestured to the screen, where the words appeared in bold, black letters against a white background, towering over me like a tombstone. Official notice of disownment. "Today," Victoria Bracken announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "we are here to officially disown Tessa Bracken. She has blackened the honor of this family for the last time." Richard stepped up to the microphone, his voice overlaying hers. "Effective immediately, Tessa is removed from the family trust. She is stripped of any claim to the Bracken estate. She is removed from the line of succession for Bracken Holdings. She is to receive nothing, not 1 cent, not 1 share, not 1 single remnant of the legacy she has spat upon." "We do this," my mother added, looking straight into the camera of the nearest live streamer, "with heavy hearts, but a rotten branch must be cut to save the tree." The room was in chaos. People were standing up to get a better view. The sound of whispering was like the buzzing of a million hornets. I stood there, the center of their universe of scorn. I felt naked, exposed, flayed alive by their judgment. "And," my father added, delivering the final twist of the knife, "since she has chosen to live a life of crime and debauchery, she can finance it herself. The $50,000 held in her grandmother's education trust, which she came here tonight to claim, has been dissolved to pay for the legal fees incurred by her theft. That was it. The money was gone. The lifeline I had clung to for 3 years, the promise that had kept me going through night shifts and cup noodles, vanished in a puff of malicious smoke. My mother lowered the microphone. The performance was over. The verdict had been read. The sentence had been passed. For a moment, I could not hear anything but the rushing of blood in my ears. It sounded like the ocean. I looked at my hands. They were shaking so hard, I had to clasp them together. I looked at the exit, miles away across the ballroom floor. I looked at the security guards, their arms crossed, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to scream, to cry, to provide the final clip for the evening news that would prove my parents right. See? Look how unstable she is. I closed my eyes. I felt the heat of the spotlight on my eyelids. I felt the vibration of the floor as people shifted and moved. I thought about the box in my purse. I thought about the weight of the USB drive in my pocket. I thought about the spreadsheet I had spent 6 months building, cell by agonizing cell. They thought this was the end. They thought they had buried me. They forgot that you should never bury a seed unless you want it to grow. When I opened my eyes, the tears they expected were not there. The fear that had paralyzed me was gone, burned away by a white-hot clarity. The silence in my head was total. My mother was still watching me, waiting for the collapse. She wanted me to run. She wanted me to flee in shame so she could accept the condolences of her friends and play the grieving mother for the rest of the night. I looked at the security guard on my left. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. He blinked, surprised by my composure. "You need to leave, miss." "No," I said. I smoothed the front of my $45 dress. I lifted my chin. "I do not think I will." I turned my back on the exit. I turned my face toward the stage. The crowd quieted down again, confused. Why wasn't she running? Why wasn't she crying? I took a step toward the stage. Then another. The security guards hesitated. They had orders to stop a hysterical girl, not a woman walking with the precision of a soldier marching into battle. My parents stood on the stage, looking down at me. For the first time, the confidence in my mother's eyes flickered. She frowned. This was not in the script. I kept walking. I walked through the sea of tables, through the whispering guests, through the hostility and the judgment. I walked until I was standing right at the foot of the stairs leading up to the platform where my parents stood like false gods. I was not the defendant anymore. I was the prosecutor. And court was just about to begin. Time seemed to curdle around me. The air in the ballroom, previously filled with the hum of air conditioning and the rustle of expensive fabrics, had gone completely still. It was a physical sensation, heavy and gelatinous, pressing against my eardrums. I sat there, my hands resting on the white tablecloth, and I felt a strange detachment from my own body. It was as if my soul had taken a half step back, hovering just behind my left shoulder, observing the wreckage of my life with the clinical interest of a coroner at a crime scene. My blood felt sluggish, turning into slush in my veins. The physiological reaction to extreme shock is fascinating. First, there is the denial, the brain's desperate attempt to reject the data it is receiving. Then comes the adrenaline, the fight or flight response. But I was stuck in the third state, the freeze. I was a statue carved from ice, sitting in the center of a coliseum while the lions circled. I slowly turned my head, the movement feeling mechanical. My eyes locked onto Jason. He was standing by the pillar, his phone still raised, recording my humiliation for posterity. The smirk on his face was not just amusement, it was relief. He looked like a man who had just watched his only rival for the throne be executed. He was practically vibrating with glee. He gave a little salute with his champagne glass, a silent toast to my demise. Then my gaze drifted to Aunt Carla. She was whispering to a woman in emerald satin, her hand covering her mouth, but her eyes were fixed on me. They were cold, hard beads of judgment. There was no pity there. There was only the satisfaction of a woman who had always believed I was too independent, too stubborn, too much. Finally seeing me put in my place, she looked vindicated, as if my public destruction proved every nasty rumor she had ever spread at Thanksgiving dinners. In that frozen moment, the present dissolved, and I was pulled backward. I was 7 years old. It was Christmas Eve at the Bracken estate. I was wearing a velvet dress that scratched my skin and patent leather shoes that pinched my toes until they were numb. My mother had spent an hour curling my hair, burning my ear twice with the iron, scolding me for flinching. We were posing for the family Christmas card. "Smile, Tessa," she had hissed, her fingers digging into my shoulder with enough pressure to leave a bruise. "Look happy. Look perfect. No one wants to see a sullen child." I had smiled. I had learned early on that my face did not belong to me. It belonged to the brand. I was an accessory, a prop to be wheeled out to demonstrate the fertility and domestic bliss of the Bracken dynasty. If I got good grades, it was proof of their superior genetics. If I played the piano well, it was a testament to their investment in culture. I was not a person. I was a return on investment. And when the return diminished when I chose a state university over the Ivy League, when I chose accounting over a strategic marriage, when I chose truth over loyalty, I became a liability. The memory snapped shut, bringing me back to the blinding white light of the ballroom. Why now? The question floated to the surface of my mind, cutting through the fog of shock. Why this extravagance? Why spend $200,000 on a party just to humiliate me? They could have disowned me via a lawyer's letter. They could have cut me off with a text message. Why the audience? Why the live stream? My eyes darted to the screen behind my parents, where the words, "Official Notice of Disownment," still loomed. And then it clicked. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, snapping my head back. It was not about the drugs. It was not about the morality. It was not even about the rebellion. It was about the timeline. I looked at the date on my watch. It was the 29th of the month. The audit report I had been finalizing, the one detailing the $3 million moved to the Cayman Islands, the one flagging the fake invoices from construction companies that did not exist, was scheduled to be filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission on the 1st of next month. 3 days from now. If I filed that report as a respected, credible forensic accountant, it would trigger a federal investigation. It would end them. But if I filed that report as a disgruntled, disowned, drug-addicted daughter who had just been publicly shamed for stealing from the company, then I was not a whistleblower. I was a vindictive child lashing out. I was an unreliable witness. Any defense attorney worth their retainer would tear my testimony to shreds in court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, why should you believe this woman? Her own parents had to cut her off because of her lies and substance abuse. This audit is nothing more than a revenge fantasy. The brilliance of it was sickening. They were not just killing my reputation. They were immunizing themselves against the truth. This party was a preemptive strike. It was a witness tampering operation disguised as a family tragedy. The fear that had been gripping my heart evaporated. It was replaced by something much colder, much harder, and infinitely more dangerous: contempt. I looked at my parents on the stage. My father, with his false stoicism. My mother, with her theatrical grief. They looked so small to me suddenly. For 28 years. They had been giants. They had been the gods of my universe, dispensing love and punishment according to whim. I had spent my entire life craving their approval, terrified of their rejection. But you cannot be afraid of losing something that never existed. They did not love me. They had never loved me. They loved the idea of me. They loved the control they had over me. And now that they had lost control, they were trying to destroy the vessel. The realization was liberating. It was like shedding a heavy winter coat in the middle of a desert. I felt light. I felt clear. The emotional tether that had bound me to them, the guilt, the obligation, the desperate need for validation snapped. I was no longer their daughter. I was their auditor. And they had just made the biggest accounting error of their lives. Now, my mother's voice broke the silence. Returning to the microphone, she sounded exhausted, a performance of maternal fatigue that deserved an award. "You can leave, Tessa. Please, go, and do not ever come back." She gestured vaguely toward the doors, dismissing me like a servant who had spilled the soup. A movement to my right caught my attention. A waiter, a young man with a terrified expression, stepped forward. He reached out to pull my chair back, clearly signaling that I should stand up and be escorted out by security. His hand hovered inches from my shoulder. I turned my head slowly and looked at him. I did not speak. I did not need to. I channeled every ounce of the rage, the betrayal, and the newfound power coursing through me into a single look. My eyes were dry, wide, and sharp as diamonds. "Do not touch me." My eyes said, "If you touch me, you will burn." The waiter froze. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at my face, saw the absolute lack of hysteria, saw the cold fire burning there, and he stepped back. He lowered his head and retreated into the shadows. Good. I took a deep breath. The air still smelled of orchids, but it no longer made me feel like I was suffocating. It smelled like fuel. I placed my hands on the table and pushed myself up. My legs were steady. My hands were steady. I stood to my full height. I was wearing heels, which gave me an extra 3 inches. I felt tall. The room held its breath. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to cover my face and run, sobbing, toward the exit. They wanted the money shot. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my dress. It was a navy blue sheath, bought on clearance, but in that moment, it felt like a suit of armor. I brushed an invisible speck of dust from my hip. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder. Every movement was deliberate, slow, and agonizingly calm. I lifted my head and looked straight at the stage. My mother was watching me, her handkerchief poised halfway to her eyes. My father was frowning, his brow furrowed. This was not the reaction they had simulated. I was off script. I locked eyes with Victoria Bracken, and then I did the unthinkable. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not a sad smile. It was a small, sharp upturn of the lips. It was the smile of a chess player who sees checkmate 5 moves before their opponent does. It was the smile of the wolf who realizes the shepherd has left the gate open. The confusion on my mother's face was instant. Her perfect mask slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine panic. She glanced at Richard. He looked equally baffled. Why is she smiling? Their eyes asked each other. She should be destroyed. I stepped away from the table, but I did not turn toward the double doors at the back of the room. I did not turn toward the exit signs glowing red in the darkness. I turned toward the stage. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. It started as a murmur and grew into a collective gasp. I could hear the rustle of fabric as people leaned forward. The air crackled with tension. Where is she going? What is she doing? I put one foot in front of the other. My heels clicked against the marble floor. A steady, rhythmic beat that echoed in the silence. Click, click, click. It sounded like the ticking of a bomb. The security guards at the edge of the dance floor shifted, uncertain. They looked to my father for orders, but he was too stunned to react. He just stood there, staring at me as I approached, like a captain watching a torpedo wake streak toward his hull. I walked past the table where the bank executives sat. Their mouths were open. I walked past the table where Jason stood, his phone still recording, but his grin replaced by a slack-jawed stare. I was not walking to my execution. I was walking to my inauguration. I reached the foot of the stairs leading up to the stage. There were 3 steps. 3 steps between the victim and the victor. 3 steps between the lie and the truth. My mother took a half step back, her hand clutching the microphone stand as if it were a weapon. "Tessa," she hissed, her voice caught by the mic, booming out distorted and shrill. "What are you doing?" "Get out." I ignored her. I placed my foot on the first step. The crowd went completely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. 200 people were suspended in time, watching the girl they had just discarded climb out of the trash heap and ascend the throne. I took the second step. I took the third step. I was on the stage. The lights were blindingly hot up here. I could see the sweat beading on my father's upper lip. I could see the panic fluttering in the pulse point of my mother's neck. They were close enough to touch. They smelled of fear and expensive cologne. I was right where I needed to be, and the silence was no longer heavy. It was waiting. It was waiting for me to fill it. The air on the stage was thinner than it was on the floor. It was rarefied, hot, and smelled intensely of the heavy, musky cologne my father had worn since the 90s. Richard Bracken stood before me. A blockage in the artery of my progress. Up close, the imposing figure he cut from a distance dissolved into a map of aging and stress. I could see the spider veins on his nose, the frantic pulse beating against his starch-stiffened collar, and the terror swimming in his eyes. He did not look like a tycoon. He looked like a man watching a dam break. He moved to intercept me, his body shifting to block my path to the microphone stand where my mother stood frozen, his hand raised. Not to strike me, he would never be so gauche in front of an audience, but to corral me, to guide me off the stage with a grip of iron disguised as a paternal steer. "Tessa," he growled, the sound vibrating low in his chest, inaudible to the crowd below but deafening to me. "Get down, now. Do not make this worse for yourself." He reached for my arm. His fingers were inches away from my bicep. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I leaned in, invading his personal space, crossing the invisible barrier he had maintained between us for my entire adult life. I brought my face close enough to his that I could see the dilated pupils of his eyes. "Do you want me to scream about the gambling debt in Vegas right now?" I whispered. The words were soft, barely a breath, but they hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. He froze. His hand stopped in midair, trembling slightly. The color drained from his face so fast, it was as if I had pulled a plug. "The $4 million, Dad," I continued, my voice silky and lethal. "The Bellagio. The loan sharks you borrowed from to pay the casino before the shareholders found out. I saw the wire transfers. I know who you paid. Richard Bracken, the man who had terrified boardrooms for 3 decades, turned to stone, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me with a new expression. It was not anger, it was not even hate. It was the sheer, paralyzing horror of a man realizing that his darkest secret was held in the hands of the person he had just tried to destroy. "Step aside," I said. He did not move voluntarily. He simply ceased to function as an obstacle. He slumped slightly, his confident posture collapsing, and I walked past him as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. I was now standing center stage. My mother, Victoria, was 5 feet away. She was clutching the microphone stand with both hands, her knuckles white, her red nails digging into the metal. She looked at me as if I were a ghost that had just risen from the grave to haunt her. She opened her mouth to speak. Perhaps to call security again. Perhaps to try and talk over me. But I did not give her the chance. I did not ask for the microphone. I did not wait for her to yield the floor. I reached out and grabbed the neck of the microphone stand. My hand closed over hers. Her skin was cold and clammy. For a second, we were locked in a silent struggle. A tug of war between mother and daughter, between the old regime and the new order. She resisted, pulling back, her eyes wide with disbelief. I yanked it. I pulled the microphone from her grip with a violent, decisive jerk. The movement was so sudden that her hand slipped, and her nails scraped against the mesh of the mic. The sound system, already sensitive, reacted instantly. Scream! A piercing squelch of audio feedback tore through the ballroom. It was a high-pitched, agonizing wail that sounded like a banshee screaming. The effect was instantaneous. 200 people in the audience flinched in unison. Hands flew up to cover ears. The polite murmuring stopped dead. The clinking of silverware ceased. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. The noise cut through the social niceties and the pretense of the evening, shattering the carefully curated atmosphere my mother had spent months building. I stood there, the microphone in my hand, the feedback dying down to a low. menacing hum. My mother stumbled back a step, massaging her wrist, staring at me with a mixture of fury and fear. I turned to the crowd. From up here, they looked different. They were no longer a monolith of judgment. They were individuals. I saw the faces clearly now. I saw Mr. Sterling, the head of the investment bank that held the majority of Bracken Holdings' debt. I saw the sleek, predatory profiles of our competitors. I saw the confused, frightened faces of the distant relatives. I took a breath. I let the silence stretch. I let them look at me. I let them see the girl who was supposed to be a drug addict, supposed to be unstable, supposed to be broken. I stood tall, my shoulders back, my eyes clear and focused. "Thank you, Mom and Dad," I said. My voice boomed through the speakers, magnified, crisp, and terrifyingly steady. There was no tremor. There was no slur. It was the voice of a professional. "Thank you for the party," I continued, my tone flat, devoid of warmth. "It is truly quite a spectacle. I see you spared no expense, but then again, you never do when it comes to image." I walked to the edge of the stage, the microphone cord trailing behind me like a whip. I scanned the front row. "My mother," I said, gesturing casually behind me to where Victoria stood trembling, "told you just now that she is here to disown me. She told you that I am a thief, that I am an addict, that I am a disgrace." I paused. I made eye contact with the CEO of a rival logistics firm. He was leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. He knew something was happening. He could smell the blood in the water. "But that is not why we are here," I said, dropping my voice an octave, making them lean in to hear me. "My mother is not here to disown me because she is disappointed in me. She is here because she is afraid of me." A gasp rippled through the room. It was a small sound, breathless and scandalized. I saw heads turn to look at each other. The narrative was fracturing. The story they had been fed, the tragic tale of the wayward daughter, was cracking under the weight of my composure. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, "I have not been home in 3 years. That part is true. But it is not because I was in rehab, and it is certainly not because I was in jail." I stopped and looked directly at the camera that was live streaming the event. I spoke to the lens, knowing that thousands of people were watching, knowing that this video would be on the internet forever. I have not been home in 3 years because 3 years ago, I was asked to sign a document. I let the words hang there. I saw Mr. Sterling stiffen. He was a banker. He knew what it meant when family members refused to sign documents. I was asked to sign off on a series of invoices for a subsidiary company called North Star Logistics, I said, my voice gaining strength, becoming harder, sharper. I was 25 years old. I had just finished my master's degree in forensic accounting. My father thought I would just sign where he pointed. He thought I was a good little soldier. I turned back to look at my father. He was leaning against the back wall of the stage, clutching his chest, his face gray. He looked like a man having a heart attack, or perhaps wishing he was having one. "But I read the invoices," I told the crowd. "And then I cross-referenced them with the shipping manifests. And then I checked the tax records." The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. It went from the tension of a family drama to the cold, hard dread of a corporate disaster. The guests were no longer looking at me with pity or scorn. They were looking at me with suspicion, and more importantly, they were looking at my parents with doubt. "There was no North Star Logistics," I said, my voice ringing out like a gavel strike. "It was a shell company. It existed only on paper. And yet, Bracken Holdings had paid $12 million in consulting fees over 2 years. Liar." The scream came from behind me. Victoria Bracken had snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the grieving mother had shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. She did not look elegant anymore. Her face was twisted into a rictus of rage. Her veins bulged in her neck. She lunged at me. It was a shocking break in protocol. High society matrons do not lunge. They do not attack people physically on stage. But Victoria was watching her life burn down in real time. An instinct took over. She reached for the microphone, her hands clawing at the air, her eyes wild. "Shut up!" she shrieked. "Shut her up! She is crazy. She is off her medication." I did not move. I did not need to. As she rushed toward me, the long, flowing train of her blood-red silk dress, the dress she had chosen to make her look regal, to make her look like a queen caught on the sharp metal edge of a floor monitor speaker. It happened in slow motion. She jerked forward, but her dress stayed behind. The fabric pulled tight, acting like a tether. Her momentum carried her upper body forward while her feet were swept out from under her. She fell. It was not a graceful swoon. It was a hard, ugly, uncontrolled fall. She hit the wooden floor of the stage with a sickening thud that the microphone picked up and amplified. Her arms flailed, knocking over a vase of white orchids that stood on a pedestal nearby. The vase shattered, sending ceramic shards and water skittering across the stage. The crowd cried out in shock. People jumped from their seats. My mother lay there, sprawled on the floor in a tangle of red silk and broken porcelain. Her hair was in her face. Her shoe had come off. She tried to scramble up, but her dress was still caught, trapping her like a fly in a web. She looked up at me, panting, her makeup smeared, her eyes filled with humiliation. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. 5 minutes ago, she was the empress, and I was the peasant. Now, I stood above her, calm, composed, holding the microphone, the symbol of voice and agency, while she crawled at my feet. Silenced by her own vanity, I looked down at her. I felt no pity. I felt no satisfaction. I felt only the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor looking at a bankrupt entity. I stepped over the puddle of water spreading from the broken vase. I did not offer her a hand. I turned back to the audience, who were staring at the scene with open mouths. "As you can see," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic murmuring, "the foundations of this house are not as stable as they appear." I looked at the bank partners again. They were not live streaming anymore. They were texting. They were making calls. They were panic selling. "My mother called me a thief," I said, bringing the microphone closer to my lips. "She said I stole from the company. She said I sold secrets." I reached into the pocket of my dress. My fingers closed around the cold metal of the USB drive. "I did not steal anything," I said. "I preserved evidence." The room went deadly silent again. The sight of my mother on the floor and the promise of what was in my pocket held them in a trance. "You wanted to know why I am being disowned," I said, addressing the room but looking straight at Jason, who was now backed against the wall, looking like he wanted to vomit. "You wanted a show. You wanted a scandal." I held up the USB drive. It glinted under the spotlight, a tiny silver object that contained enough data to sink a battleship. "Well," I said, "I hope you are all watching closely, because the show is just beginning." I turned toward the sleek, silver laptop sitting on the podium to my right. It was the control center for my father's presentation, the machine that had just been used to project my alleged sins onto a 20-foot screen. The AV technician, a young man named Kevin whom I had bumped into earlier near the loading dock, was standing in the wings. We locked eyes. Kevin had been working double shifts for minimum wage while my father tipped valets with $100 bills. Earlier, I had slipped Kevin $500 my grocery budget for the next 2 months and told him simply, "When I plug in my drive, do not cut the feed." He gave me a barely perceptible nod and stepped back from his console, crossing his arms. I inserted the USB drive into the port. The screen behind me flickered. The doctored photo of me passing out at a party vanished. In its place, a dense, complex spreadsheet appeared. It was not pretty. It was rows and columns of raw data, highlighted in aggressive reds and yellows. To the uninitiated, it looked like homework. To the bankers in the room, it looked like a confession. "What you are looking at," I said, my voice calm and professorial, is the unredacted general ledger for the Bracken Children's Hope Foundation for the fiscal year of 2024. A murmur went through the crowd. The Children's Hope Foundation was my mother's pet project, the shield she used to deflect any criticism of our family's greed. If you look at column E, I continued, pointing to the screen where the numbers were magnified, you will see a series of recurring donations coming in from 3 specific shell companies: Blue Water Holdings, Apex Solutions, and Nebulous Ventures. These donations total exactly $4,500,000 over a period of 6 months. I hit the spacebar on the laptop. The slide changed. Now, it showed a web of bank transfers. These companies, I explained, breaking down the forensic trail, do not sell products. They do not have employees. They do not have offices. What they do have are IP addresses traced back to a server farm in a jurisdiction known for hosting online gambling syndicates and, more concerningly, organizations tied to human trafficking. The room went cold. The air conditioning felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. The clinking of glasses had stopped long ago. Now, even the breathing seemed to stop. Accusing a company of tax fraud is one thing. Accusing a high society charity of laundering money for organized crime is a nuclear option. Lies, my father roared. He had recovered from his shock enough to find his voice. He was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck, looking like a bull about to charge. Turn it off. Someone cut the power. She's making this up. He scrambled toward the technician in the wings, but Kevin had conveniently disappeared into the shadows. Richard Bracken slammed his hand onto the technician's console, mashing buttons, but nothing happened. You cannot turn it off, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through his panic. I encrypted the file execution. It runs on a loop until the decryption key is entered, and I am the only one who has it. I turned back to the audience, adopting the stance of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. The money comes in as anonymous donations, allowing the foundation to issue tax-deductible receipts, I explained, walking them through the mechanics of the wash. Then, 70% of that money is paid out in consulting fees and administrative costs to a construction firm called JB Development. I hit the key again. A new document appeared. It was a scanned copy of a contract, with a signature scrawled at the bottom in blue ink. JB Development, I said, reading the name aloud. Now, who could JB possibly be? I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with my cousin Jason. He was still standing near the wall, but he looked like he was about to faint. He was sweating so profusely that his shirt was clinging to his chest. Jason Bracken, I said, pointing at him. The spotlight swung wildly, hitting him in the face. He threw his hands up as if physically struck. The director of JB Development, a company that has never built a single house, but somehow managed to invoice the charity for $3 million in site surveys last year alone. It was for the orphanage project, Jason stammered, his voice cracking. We were scouting locations. $3 million to scout locations, I asked, raising an eyebrow. For an orphanage that was never built, for land that was never purchased. I clicked to the next slide. It was an email chain. The subject line read, Cleaning the Vegas issue. The sender was Jason. The recipient was Richard Bracken. The content was damningly simple. The transfer is done. The laundry is clean. The foundation accounts are balanced. We can pay the loan sharks on Tuesday. This is not just embezzlement, I stated, my voice echoing off the gold leaf ceiling. This is wire fraud. This is money laundering. This is a violation of the RICO Act, and every single person in this room who sits on the board of that foundation, I looked pointedly at my Aunt Carla, whose martini glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, is potentially liable for negligence and complicity. The panic in the room was now palpable. It was no longer a social gathering. It was a crime scene. I saw the partners from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan standing up, their phones pressed to their ears. I could hear snippets of their frantic conversations. Get legal on the line, now. Pull the credit facility, immediately. I do not care about the penalties. We need a statement disavowing any knowledge. Draft it now. My father was shaking the laptop podium, trying to rip the cords out, but they were secured with cable ties. He looked up at me, his eyes wild with a mixture of hatred and terror. "You ungrateful little wretch," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You have destroyed everything. You have ruined us." "I did not ruin you. Richard," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. It felt strange, like tasting a new food. "I just turned on the lights. You were the one who filled the room with garbage." He lunged for me then. It was a clumsy, desperate move. He reached for my throat, his hands hooked into claws. "Security!" he screamed. "Arrest her! She hacked my computer. She is a cyber terrorist." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply spoke into the microphone. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He stopped, inches from me. "Why?" he sneered. "Because you think you can fight me." "No," I said, glancing at the digital clock on the laptop screen. "Because exactly 3 minutes ago, at 7 o'clock sharp, a scheduled email was sent from my secure server." I looked out at the audience, ensuring everyone heard this. That email contained a zip file with 5 years of forensic accounting data, including everything you see on this screen and terabytes more. It includes the audio recordings of board meetings where you discussed bribing safety inspectors. It includes the original, unaltered tax returns. I paused for effect. "And that email was not sent to the tabloids," I said softly. "It was sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division, and the Internal Revenue Service." My father's face went slack. The rage drained out of him, replaced by the hollow, gray look of a dead man walking. His hands dropped to his sides. "You didn't," he whispered. "You couldn't. We are your family." "You disowned me," I reminded him, my voice devoid of emotion. "You stood on this stage 10 minutes ago and told the world I was dead to you. You wanted to make me a stranger. Fine. I am a stranger. And strangers have no obligation to protect your crimes." "The audit report," Jason moaned from the side of the room. He had slid down the wall and was now sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "Oh God. The audit report." "The audit report is the least of your worries." "Jason," I said, addressing him through the mic, "the structuring charges alone carry a mandatory minimum of 5 years in federal prison, and given that you used a charity for sick children to wash drug money, the judge is not going to be lenient." The reality of the situation was settling over the room like a shroud. The guests were backing away from my family as if they were contagious. No one wanted to be in the frame when the inevitable photos were taken. The social distancing was instantaneous and brutal. My mother, who had managed to untangle herself from her dress and stand up, was now leaning against the piano, clutching her chest. She looked at the screen, at the numbers that spelled out her doom, and then at me. "We gave you everything," she sobbed, trying one last time to manipulate the narrative. "We gave you life. We gave you a home. How can you be so cruel?" I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the woman who had criticized my weight since I was 12, the woman who had told me my laugh was too loud, my dreams were too small, and my existence was a burden. "You gave me a roof, Victoria," I said. "You did not give me a home, and as for cruelty bringing me here tonight to humiliate me in front of the entire city, because you needed a scapegoat for your financial crimes, that is cruelty. What I am doing is not cruelty, it is accountability." I turned back to the laptop and typed a quick command. The screen changed one last time. The spreadsheet vanished. In its place appeared a single document, the official notice of disownment, that they had projected earlier. But I had made an edit. I had superimposed a red stamp over it. Accepted. "You wanted to cut ties," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "Consider them cut. I am not Tessa Bracken anymore. I am the witness for the prosecution, and I suggest you all call your lawyers. You are going to need them." The sound of sirens began to bleed into the room from the street outside, faint at first, then growing louder. wailing like banshees coming to collect the souls of the damned. Blue and red lights began to flash against the high windows of the ballroom, cutting through the gold and white decor with violent, strobing colors. My father looked at the windows. He looked at the exits. He realized, finally, that there was no way out. The empire he had built on lies and intimidation had just been dismantled by a girl in a $45 dress and a USB drive. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, unplugging my drive and stepping back from the podium, "I believe the party is over." The ballroom of the Gilded Cage had transformed into a cage of a very different sort. If the previous few minutes had been a courtroom drama, the atmosphere now shifted into the chaotic, primal energy of a shipwreck. The sirens outside were growing louder, a wailing chorus that seemed to vibrate against the high, arched windows. But the real panic was happening right here, under the crystal chandeliers. From my vantage point on the stage, I watched the disintegration of the Bracken dynasty. It was not a slow fade. It was a structural collapse. The first crack in the facade appeared in the form of my cousin, Jason. The man who had spent the evening preening like a peacock, swirling his scotch and making snide comments about my financial status, was now undergoing a physiological meltdown. The confidence that usually armored him had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified boy in an expensive suit. I watched as he realized that the cleaning of the Vegas issue The Crime I had just broadcast to 200 of the city's most powerful people was signed with his digital fingerprint. Jason's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not involve walking past the police who were undoubtedly gathering in the lobby. He began to back away from the wall, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He abandoned his champagne glass on a passing tray, not caring that it tipped over and spilled, and started to push his way through the crowd toward the kitchen service doors. "Excuse me, move," he muttered, shoving a senator's wife aside with none of his usual charm. "I have to make a call." But the crowd, which had been so pliable and adoring only an hour ago, had turned into a wall of granite. They did not move for him. A large man, the chief financial officer of a construction firm that Bracken Holdings had stiffed on payments last year, stepped deliberately into Jason's path. "Going somewhere, son?" the man asked, his voice booming over the murmur of the crowd. Jason recoiled, sweat visible on his forehead even from where I stood. "Get out of my way," he squeaked, his voice cracking. "I am not involved in this. I was just following orders." "That is not what the email said." "Jason," I said into the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I didn't have to. The sound system carried my words directly to him, pinning him like a spotlight. "The email said you handled the transfer personally. You authorized the shell company. You are not a pawn. Jason, you are the architect." He froze, looking back at me with pure hatred, but his legs gave out. He stumbled, catching himself on a chair, looking for all the world like a captain trying to flee his own ship before the women and children. While Jason was trying to vanish, the war on the main floor escalated. Aunt Carla, the woman who had earlier toasted to my exclusion from the family, suddenly realized that her complicity was no longer a secret she could giggle about over martinis. She had been on the board of the charity. Her signature was on the minutes of the meetings where the fraud was discussed. She turned on my father with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "You told me it was legal," Carla shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing. She abandoned all pretense of decorum, marching up to where Richard stood frozen near the stage. She shoved him hard in the chest. My father, a man who usually commanded absolute physical respect, stumbled back, too shocked to defend himself. "Carla, calm down," Richard stammered, his face the color of ash. "We can fix this." "It is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding!" Carla screamed, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo and shaking him. "She has the bank transfers, Richard. She has the ledger. You told me that money was an investment return. You told me I was insulated." "I protected you," Richard roared back, his own temper finally snapping as the stress broke his composure. "I bought you that house in the Hamptons with that money. You didn't ask questions when the checks were clearing. Did you?" You dragged me into this, Carla wailed, turning to the crowd, her hands out in a pleading gesture. I didn't know, I swear. I didn't know. He used me. He used his own sister. It was a pathetic display. The guests watched with open mouths as the distinguished Bracken siblings tore at each other like feral dogs fighting over scraps. The illusion of the united, perfect family was not just broken, it was being pulverized. But the most dangerous player on the board had not yet conceded. My mother, Victoria, had pulled herself up from the floor. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair was wild, and her mascara was beginning to run, giving her the look of a deranged beauty queen. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Carla. She looked at the audience. She grabbed the backup microphone from the podium, the one intended for the band's singer, and switched it on. Listen to me, she screamed, her voice distorting with the gain. Please, everyone, listen to me. Look at her. She pointed a shaking finger at me. I stood motionless, watching her unravel. This is not real, Victoria yelled, her eyes wide and manic. Tessa is sick. She has been sick for years. This is a psychotic episode. She fabricated all of this. She is a computer genius. She forged the documents. She is trying to hurt us because we tried to get her help. She moved toward the edge of the stage, pleading with the faces in the front row. Mr. Sterling, you know us, she begged the banker. You know our family. You know we are good people. Would we steal from children? Would we? This is a vendetta. My daughter is off her medication. She is hallucinating. None of this is admissible. For a second, just a split second, I saw hesitation in the eyes of a few guests. The lie was audacious. But my mother was a master performer. She was banking on their class solidarity, on their desire to believe that one of their own could not possibly be a criminal, just the victim of a crazy daughter. She needs a hospital, Victoria cried, tears streaming down her face, now real tears of frustration. Oh, my poor baby girl. She has lost her mind completely. I let her finish. I let the echo of her accusations hang in the air. I let the audience wonder, just for a heartbeat, if perhaps there was a grain of truth to it. Then I leaned into my microphone. I expected you to say that. Mother, I said softly, I expected you to play the insanity card. It is your favorite move. I turned back to the laptop. You say I forged the documents, I continued, my voice hardening. You say I fabricated the numbers, and perhaps, to some people in this room who do not understand forensic accounting, a spreadsheet might seem easy to fake. I looked out at the crowd, my gaze sweeping over them. But a voice is much harder to forge, especially yours. I tapped a key on the keyboard. A media player opened on the screen. The file name was simple: Victoria_Bracken_office_November_12.w.AV. Last November, I said, setting the scene. There was an accident at the Bracken manufacturing plant in Ohio. A boiler exploded. 2 workers were critically injured. The official report said it was operator error. The insurance company paid out, and the workers were fired without severance. Victoria went still. The frantic energy drained out of her, replaced by a sudden, statue-like stillness. She knew what was coming. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Tessa, don't. This is a recording from a bug I placed in your office lamp 3 days after the accident, I said. When I was visiting to make amends, as you called it, I pressed play. The audio that blasted through the ballroom speakers was crystal clear. There was no static. It was the sound of a high-quality recording device. First voice, Victoria. I do not care what the safety inspector found. Richard, make it go away. Second voice, Richard. He says the valve was rusted through. He says we ignored 3 maintenance requests. If this goes to court, we are looking at criminal negligence. The sheer negligence could put us away. First voice, Victoria. Then do not let it go to court. How much does the inspector want? 50,100. Second voice, Richard. He is asking for 200 to lose the report. First voice, Victoria. Pay him. Take it from the charity fund. Mark it as emergency relief. And get rid of those 2 workers. Threaten to sue them for destroying company property if they talk. I am not letting a couple of blue-collar nobodies ruin my quarterly projection. Click. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of revulsion. Financial fraud was one thing. In this room full of sharks, money games were understood, even if they were illegal. But this was visceral. This was callous disregard for human life. This was a mother discussing the destruction of injured workers and the bribery of officials with the same tone she would use to order a caterer. Victoria Bracken stood on the stage, the microphone dangling from her hand. She looked small. She looked naked. The mask of the benevolent philanthropist had not just slipped. I had ripped it off and set it on fire. She that was, Victoria stammered, but her voice was weak. She looked at the crowd, but this time, no one looked back. They were looking at their shoes. They were looking at the ceiling. They were looking anywhere but at her. Disgusting, a voice said. It was Mr. Sterling. The banker stood up, buttoning his jacket. He did not look at my parents. He looked at his team. We are leaving, he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. Cancel all pending transactions with Bracken Holdings immediately, freeze their accounts, and draft a press release stating that we have severed all ties effective this minute. Wait, Richard cried, stepping forward, his hands reaching out. John, please, let's talk about this. Do not speak to me, Sterling said, his voice like ice. Do not ever speak to me again. He turned and walked toward the exit. It was the signal the rest of the room had been waiting for. The dam broke. I want my investment back, a woman shouted from the back of the room. I am calling my lawyer. I am resigning from the board, another man yelled, pulling his phone out. I am not going down for this. The room erupted into a frenzy of motion. It was a stampede of self-preservation. 200 of the city's elite were rushing for the doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Bracken name. They were not just leaving a party. They were fleeing a crime scene. I watched the staff of the Gilded Cage, the waiters, who had been standing along the walls, were now exchanging panicked glances. The maitre d', the ferret-faced man who had sneered at me earlier, was frantically tapping on a tablet. He walked over to a senior manager, whispering urgently and pointing at my parents. I knew exactly what he was saying. The credit cards are going to bounce. Who is going to pay for the lobster? Who is going to pay for the orchids? He signaled to the security team, the same team my father had tried to sick on me. The guards nodded and moved, but they did not move toward me. They moved to block the side exits, not to keep people in, but to ensure that the host didn't slip out before the bill was settled. My parents were alone. They stood in the center of the stage, surrounded by the wreckage of their reputation. The guests were streaming out, their backs turned. The live stream was still running, broadcasting their shame to the world. The police sirens were now right outside the front door, the blue lights flashing rhythmically against the ballroom walls, casting long, dancing shadows. Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands, defeated. Victoria stood frozen, staring at the empty space where her admirers used to be. She looked like a ghost in a red dress, haunting the ruins of her own ego. And I stood there. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. But beneath it, a core of steel that had been forged in the fire of their rejection. I was the only thing in the room that was solid. I was the only thing that was real. I looked at the chaos I had unleashed. It was total. It was catastrophic. And it was just... The microphone was still in my hand. I lifted it one last time. You spent 28 years trying to mold me into someone who would support this lie, I said to their backs. They didn't turn around, but I knew they could hear me. You wanted a daughter who was smart enough to carry the legacy, but obedient enough not to question it. You failed. I placed the microphone back on the stand. It clicked into place with a sound that felt like a lock snapping shut. "You should have just let me be an accountant," I said. I stepped back from the podium, leaving them to the silence, to the impending sirens, and to the absolute, crushing weight of the truth. I was the author of this ending, and for the first time in my life, I liked the story I was telling. The stampede of the city's elite was a sight to behold. It was a flurry of silk and cashmere, a desperate scramble of people who would sooner chew off their own limbs than be caught in the blast radius of a scandal. They flowed toward the exits like water draining from a broken tub, their heads down, their phones pressed to their ears, their loyalty to the Bracken name evaporating with every step they took away from the stage. But not everyone was leaving. Amidst the swirling chaos of fleeing bankers and panicked socialites, a sound emerged. It was distinct, rhythmic, and shockingly calm. Clap, clap, clap. It cut through the frantic murmuring and the distant sirens like a heartbeat. I looked down from the stage, my chest heaving slightly from the adrenaline of my revelation. Near the center of the room, standing like a lighthouse in a storm, was Arthur Harrison. I knew him. Of course, everyone in our world knew Arthur Harrison. He was my father's oldest rival, the CEO of Harrison Logistics. For 30 years, my father had called him a dinosaur. He had mocked Harrison for his refusal to cut corners, for his insistence on paying union wages, and for his quaint obsession with regulatory compliance. Richard Bracken had always considered himself the shark and Harrison the whale, one lethal and fast, the other slow and plodding. But tonight, the shark was bleeding out on the beach, and the whale was the last man standing. Arthur Harrison was not looking at the exit. He was looking at me. He was an older man, his hair entirely white, his tuxedo cut in a style that was 20 years out of date but impeccably maintained. He stood tall, his face grave and unsmiling, bringing his hands together in a slow, deliberate applause. He stopped clapping and began to walk toward the stage. He moved against the current of the fleeing crowd. People parted for him, some pausing in their flight to watch, confused by this act of defiance. He walked with a cane, but his gait was steady. He did not look at my father, who was slumped in his chair. He did not look at my mother, who was shivering near the piano. He walked right up to the edge of the stage, stopping directly in front of me. I lowered the microphone slightly, uncertain. Was he here to gloat? Was he here to twist the knife? He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. My father flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon or a subpoena, but Arthur Harrison simply pulled out a small, cream-colored rectangle, a business card. He held it up to me. I hesitated, then knelt down at the edge of the stage to take it. His hand was weathered, the skin papery but warm. "I have spent 40 years competing against this house, Mr. Harrison said. His voice was not amplified, but in the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate vicinity, it carried clearly. It was a gravelly, deep voice, the kind that commanded respect without needing to shout. "I have watched your father undercut me, outmaneuver me, and buy his way out of corners I thought were inescapable. I always wondered how he did it." He looked at my father then, a gaze filled not with triumph, but with a profound, disappointing pity. Then he looked back at me. "Now I know," he said, "and I also know that integrity is a genetic trait that apparently skips a generation." I felt a lump form in my throat. It was the first kind word anyone had spoken to me all night. "You are braver than every man in this room combined, Miss Bracken," he said. "To stand alone against your own blood for the sake of the truth, that is not just accounting, that is heroism." He pointed a calloused finger at the card in my hand. "Veritas is a fine firm," he said, "but if they ever fail to appreciate the magnitude of what you are capable of, or if you simply tire of cleaning up other people's messes and want to help build something clean from the ground up, you call me. My private line is on the back." "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time since I had taken the stage. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison." "Head up, girl," he said, tapping his cane on the floor. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You are the only Bracken worth knowing." He tipped his head in a respectful nod, turned, and began to make his way toward the door, walking with the slow dignity of a king. But he was not the only one. As the tide of fair-weather friends receded, it revealed the rocks underneath the people who had been there all along, unnoticed and undervalued. From the shadows near the kitchen service entrance, a small group began to move forward. They were not wearing designer gowns. Their suits were ill-fitting, bought off the rack at discount stores. These were the poor relations, the second cousins, the great aunts, the people my parents invited only to fill the back tables and to accept their gifts, but whom they never allowed in the family photos. There was Uncle Ben, a mechanic from Jersey, who had once fixed my first car for free when my father refused to pay for repairs. There was Cousin Sarah, a single mother who worked 2 retail jobs and whom my mother constantly criticized for lack of ambition. There was Great Aunt Martha, who wore a dress I recognized from 5 Christmases ago. They did not run. They did not look at me with judgment. They looked at me with recognition. They walked toward the stage, forming a loose semicircle. They were silent, but their presence was screaming. They were the ones who knew what it was like to be looked down upon by Richard and Victoria. They knew the cruelty of this house better than anyone. Uncle Ben stepped forward. He looked up at me, his face rugged and lined with grease and age. He gave me a thumbs up. It was a simple, clumsy gesture, but it nearly broke me. "You did good, kid," he called out. "You did real good. We are with you, Tessa," Sarah added, clutching her purse with both hands, her chin high. "We saw what they did. We saw the menu. We saw where they sat you." My father, sensing the shift in the room, seemed to snap out of his stupor. He saw the people he considered peasants, his own kin, whom he despised rallying around the daughter he had tried to destroy. It was the final insult. His authority was not just gone. It was being mocked by the very people he deemed beneath him. "Get away from her!" Richard roared, staggering to his feet. He looked deranged, his hair wild, his tie undone. "You vultures! Get away. This is a family matter. You are not family. You are leeches." He lunged toward the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on Uncle Ben, his fists clenched. He wanted to hit someone. He wanted to assert physical dominance because he had lost every other kind. "I will throw you all out," he screamed, moving to jump down the stairs to confront them. "Security, get these losers out of my sight." But the security guards were gone, busy guarding the exits to ensure the bill was paid. Richard charged down the stairs, but he never reached Ben, in a movement that was fluid and instinctive. The group of poor relations tightened their ranks. Sarah stepped in. Aunt Martha stepped in. 2 other cousins I barely knew stepped in. They shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall between my father and me. They did not raise their hands. They did not strike him. They simply stood there, a blockade of cheap polyester and unshakable loyalty. Richard slammed into Uncle Ben's chest and bounced back. Ben didn't budge. He was a man who spent his days lifting engine blocks. My father was a man who spent his days lifting martini glasses. The physics were not in Richard's favor. "Sit down, Richard," Ben said. His voice was low and hard. "You are done bullying people, especially her." "Move," my father shrieked, shoving at them. But they were immovable. They were grounded by years of hard work and the shared solidarity of the marginalized. "She is my daughter. I own her." "You don't own anything," Sarah said, her voice shaking but defiant. "Not anymore." I stood on the stage, watching this scene unfold. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and fast. For 28 years, I had thought I was alone. I had thought family was the people who shared your last name and your address. I had thought family was the people who paid your tuition and criticized your choices. I was wrong. Family was not blood. Blood was just biology. Blood was an accident of birth. Family was the old man who respected your enemy because he respected the rules. Family was the mechanic uncle who stood between you and a monster. Family was the cousin who worked double shifts, but still had more dignity in her little finger than my mother had in her entire body. Family was a choice. It was an action. It was a shield you built together, and for the first time in my life, standing there in the wreckage of my biological family, I felt truly loved. I looked past the human wall, past the sputtering, impotent rage of my father, and I found my mother. Victoria was leaning against the grand piano. She had stopped screaming. She had stopped performing. She was watching her husband be physically blocked by the relatives she had spent a lifetime mocking, and she realized, with a dawning horror, that she had no one. She looked old. It wasn't just the lighting or the smeared makeup. It was as if the last 15 minutes had aged her 20 years. The vitality that was fueled by malice and social climbing had been drained out of her. Her posture, usually so rigid and perfect, was slumped. The lines around her mouth were deep crevices of bitterness. She looked like a painting left out in the rain colors running. Canvas warping. The image distorted into a grotesque parody of itself. She looked up and met my eyes. There was no anger left in her gaze, just a vast, hollow confusion. She looked at me as if she were trying to recognize me, as if she were trying to find the pliable, frightened child she had brought here tonight. But that child was gone. That child had died the moment I saw the orchids. I raised the microphone one last time. The room fell silent again. Even my father stopped shouting, panting heavily as he leaned against the banister, held back by the wall of my real family. I spoke directly to her. I did not shout. I did not scream. I spoke with the quiet intimacy of a secret whispered in the dark. "You were right, Mother," I said. She blinked, her lips parting slightly. "You told the crowd that you were here to disown me," I continued. "You told them I was no longer your daughter." I took a step forward, until my toes were over the edge of the stage, looking down at her from the height she had built for herself. "You got your wish," I said. "I am not your daughter, I am not your victim, and I am certainly not your legacy." I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, ensuring the words would land with maximum impact. "I am your karma," I said. "I am the bill that has finally come due. I am your nightmare." I looked at the microphone in my hand. It was a heavy wireless device. It had been the instrument of my attempted execution, and then the sword of my liberation. It had served its purpose. I opened my hand. I let gravity take over. The microphone fell. It seemed to tumble in slow motion, end over end, flashing silver under the stage lights. Thud. The sound of it hitting the wooden floorboards was not a screech of feedback this time. It was a dull, heavy, final sound. It sounded like a gavel striking the block. It sounded like a coffin lid closing. It sounded like the end. I did not look back. I did not wait for a reaction. I turned on my heel, my dress swirling around my legs, and walked away from the podium. I walked toward the side stairs where my Uncle Ben and Cousin Sarah were waiting for me. Their arms open, ready to catch me. I walked away from the spotlight and into the real world, the moment my feet touched the floorboards of the main level. The world outside exploded, the heavy oak doors of the gilded cage, which had been guarded so zealously by the valet and the private security team only an hour ago, were thrown open with a force that rattled the crystal in the chandeliers. It was not the polite entrance of a late guest. It was an invasion. Blue and red lights flooded the lobby, cutting through the warm, golden ambient lighting like strobe lights in a nightclub. The sound of sirens, which had been a rising wail in the background, was now deafening, drowning out the last murmurs of the stunned crowd. "Federal agents, nobody move hands where we can see them." The shout came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A phalanx of uniformed officers and agents in navy blue windbreakers emblazoned with the yellow letters FBI poured into the ballroom. They moved with a kinetic, terrifying efficiency that contrasted sharply with the sluggish, champagne-soaked atmosphere of the party. They did not care about the orchids. They did not care about the silk tablecloths. They knocked over chairs and brushed past billionaires as they secured the perimeter. I stood near the base of the stairs, flanked by Uncle Ben and Cousin Sarah. I felt Ben's heavy hand on my shoulder, a grounding weight in the center of the storm. I did not flinch. I checked my watch. It was 7:45 in the evening. I had sent the email to the local field office at 7 o'clock. I had calculated the average response time for a priority white-collar crime tip involving organized money laundering, factored in the travel time from the federal building downtown, and added a buffer for the warrant authorization. They were exactly 3 minutes early. "This is not a coincidence," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the agents fan out. "No," I replied, my voice flat. "It is a schedule." On the stage, the tableau of my parents' destruction was frozen in time. Richard Bracken was standing near the edge of the platform, his face a rictus of disbelief. He looked at the agents swarming his party, and for a moment, he tried to summon the ghost of his authority. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the lead agent, a tall woman with a face like carved granite. "This is a private event. I will have your badges for this." "Do you know who I am?" The agent did not pause. She marched up the stairs, her boots thudding heavily on the wood, a sound far more authoritative than my father's bluster. She stopped in front of him, pulled a folded document from her jacket, and snapped it open. "Richard Bracken," she announced, her voice carrying over the commotion without the need for a microphone. "I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the Southern District Court." "Arrest?" Richard choked out the word. "For what?" "Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and obstruction of justice," the agent recited, her tone bored, as if she were reading a grocery list. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "You are making a mistake," my father shouted, backing away until he bumped into the piano. "Call my lawyer. I demand to speak to my lawyer." "You can speak to him from the holding cell," the agent said. She grabbed his wrist, spun him around, and in one fluid motion, slapped the handcuffs on him. Click, click. The sound was small, metallic, and infinitely satisfying. It was the sound of a lock snapping shut on 30 years of tyranny. To his left, another team of agents had cornered Jason. My cousin had not made it to the kitchen. He was pressed against the service door, looking like a trapped rat. He wasn't shouting. He was weeping. As the agent pulled his arms back to cuff him, Jason's knees gave out, and he had to be held up by the collar of his expensive suit. "I didn't do it," Jason sobbed, snot running down his face. "It was my uncle. He made me sign the papers. I just wanted the bonus. Please, I have a fiancé." "Save it for the judge. Son," the officer said, hauling him upright. And then there was Victoria. My mother stood alone in the center of the stage. She was not running. She was not fighting. She was staring at the scene with a look of utter incomprehension. In her mind, this was simply not possible. Brackens did not get arrested. Brackens dined with judges. Brackens donated to police balls. The law was something that applied to other people, to the poor, to the employees, to the ones who didn't matter. An agent approached her, holding a pair of cuffs. "Victoria Bracken," he said. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She smoothed her torn dress, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. "No, you do not understand. We are hosting a party. My daughter is having an episode. You should be arresting her. She hacked our systems." "Ma'am, we have the bank records," the agent said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Please give me your hands." "I will not," she shrieked, snatching her hands away. "Do not touch me. This is silk. You will ruin it." The agent didn't argue. He simply took her arm, forced it behind her back, and secured the restraint. My mother let out a wail that sounded less like a human cry and more like a wounded animal. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated ego being crushed under the weight of reality. I looked away from the stage and turned toward the room. The irony was thick enough to taste. The photographers and videographers my mother had hired, the ones she had paid thousands of dollars to document my public shaming, were still rolling. But they weren't pointing their lenses at me anymore. They were filming the arrest of the century. Flashbulbs popped in a frenzy, illuminating the scene in harsh, staccato bursts of white light. I saw the cameraman who had been live streaming earlier zoom in on my father's cuffed hands. I saw another photographer climbing onto a chair to get a better angle of Victoria being led down the stairs by the FBI. They had wanted a spectacle. They had wanted a story that would be the talk of the town for months. They got exactly what they paid for. The headlines tomorrow would not read Bracken daughter disowned. They would read Bracken empire crumbles in federal raid. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. I waited for the joy. I waited for the rush of victory. I had spent 3 years dreaming of this moment, imagining how good it would feel to see them pay for what they had done. But the joy did not come. Instead, I felt a vast, cool emptiness. It was the feeling of a fever breaking. It was the feeling of setting down a heavy backpack after hiking for 50 miles. It was not happiness. It was relief. It was the simple, biological realization that I was safe. They could not hurt me anymore. They could not freeze my accounts. They could not gaslight me. They were just people in handcuffs. "Come on, Tessa," Uncle Ben said gently, guiding me toward the side of the room, away from the crush of the exiting guests. "Let's get you some air." We moved toward the lobby, navigating through the wreckage of the party. As we reached the double doors, a commotion behind us made me stop. "Tessa!" The scream tore through the noise of the crowd. I turned. My mother was being led out by 2 agents. She was disheveled, her makeup ruined, her hands bound behind her back. As she passed within 10 feet of me, she lunged against the agent's grip, her eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, manic intensity. "Tessa, tell them!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you made it up. I am your mother. You cannot let them take me to jail. I am Victoria Bracken." The room seemed to narrow down to just the 2 of us, the woman who had given birth to me, and the woman I had become in spite of her. She was begging. For the first time in my life, she was begging me for something. Not demanding, not commanding, begging. "Please," she sobbed, the tears cutting tracks through the layers of foundation on her face. "Baby, please fix this. You always fix everything. Fix this for Mommy." I looked at her. I looked at the fear in her eyes. I looked at the utter lack of remorse, the selfishness that still drove her to ask me to sacrifice myself to save her skin. Even now, in cuffs, she thought my purpose was to serve her. I felt the last thread of attachment snap. I did not say a word. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I simply turned my back on her. It was the loudest silence of my life. "Tessa, no Tessa." Her screams faded as the agents dragged her through the main doors and out into the night, where the flashing lights of the police cruisers awaited. I stood there in the lobby, staring at the marble floor. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the hotel floor wax and old money, and exhaled the toxicity of my childhood. "Ms. Bracken." A voice at my elbow made me look up. A young man in a suit was standing there. He wasn't FBI. He looked like a plainclothes detective. He had a badge clipped to his belt and a kind, serious face. "I am Detective Miller," he said, keeping his voice low. "Economic Crimes Division. I have been coordinating with your contact at the Bureau." "Is it done?" I asked. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "It is done," he confirmed. "We have secured the servers at the headquarters. We have the physical files from the house, and with the testimony you provided in the data dump, the district attorney is confident they will be denied bail. They are flight risks." He paused, looking at me with a mixture of professional assessment and human concern. "I also need to confirm that you are aware of the protective measures we have put in place," he said. "As the primary whistleblower and key witness in a federal RICO case involving organized crime connections, you are eligible for immediate protective custody if you feel unsafe." "I do not feel unsafe," I said, and it was the truth, for the first time in 28 years. I did not feel like I was walking on a minefield. The monsters were in the cages. The lights were on. "I do not need custody," I told him. "I just need to go home, my real home. We will have a unit patrol your building for the next 48 hours. Just as a precaution, Miller said, making a note in his notebook. And we will need you to come down to the station tomorrow morning to formalize the sworn statement. But for tonight, you are free to go. Free to go. The words hung in the air, shimmering like gold dust. Thank you, Detective, I said. I looked at Uncle Ben and Sarah. They were still standing guard, ready to fight off the world for me. Let's get out of here, I said to them. I have a sudden craving for a burger that does not cost $50. We walked out of the gilded cage, leaving the chaos, the orchids, and the ruins of the Bracken Empire behind us. The night air hit my face, cool and crisp. It smelled of exhaust and rain in the city. It smelled like freedom. The key to my apartment stuck in the lock, just as it always did. It was a cheap, brass key for a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood my mother used to refer to as industrial chic, which was her polite code for slum. But as the tumbler finally clicked and the door swung open, the sound was sweeter than any symphony I had heard in the ballrooms of the gilded cage. I stepped inside and locked the deadbolt behind me. The air in my apartment was stale and smelled faintly of the laundry detergent I had used 3 days ago. But it was mine. It was safe. I dropped my purse on the floor, the same purse that had held the USB drive that decapitated a dynasty, and walked to the kitchen counter. My phone was vibrating against the laminate surface. It had been vibrating nonstop for the 40-minute drive home. The screen was a blur of notifications. Text messages from people I had not spoken to since high school. Missed calls from numbers with area codes I did not recognize. Emails from journalists asking for exclusive comments. The little device was practically glowing with the heat of the world's sudden, ravenous attention. I did not unlock it. I did not check to see if Jason had sent a pathetic apology or if Aunt Carla was trying to guilt-trip me. I simply held down the power button on the side. I watched the screen go black. The buzzing stopped. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute. I did not shower. I did not wash my face. I stripped off the navy blue dress, leaving it in a heap on the floor, and pulled on an oversized t-shirt that had a hole in the shoulder. I crawled into my bed, pulled the duvet up to my chin, and closed my eyes. For the last 10 years, sleep had been a battleground. I would lie awake replaying conversations, analyzing my mother's passive-aggressive comments, terrified of the next shoe to drop. But tonight, the shoes had all dropped. The worst thing that could happen had happened, and I was still breathing. I fell into a sleep so deep it felt less like rest and more like a coma. When I woke up, the light filtering through my blinds was the heavy, golden slant of late afternoon. I had slept for 14 hours. I sat up and stretched. My muscles ached, a physical echo of the tension I had carried on that stage. But my head was clear. I walked to the window and peered out. There were no news vans, no paparazzi. I was just Tessa Bracken, the girl in apartment 3B. The world outside was churning, but my sanctuary held firm. I turned my phone back on. It took a full 2 minutes to boot up, overwhelmed by the data flooding in. I ignored the messages and opened the news app. The headline was in bold. Black type Bracken Empire collapses, federal raids. Expose massive fraud ring. I scrolled down. The stock for Bracken Holdings had opened that morning and immediately plummeted. Trading had been halted by the exchange after the price dropped by 60% in the first hour. The board of directors had held an emergency meeting at 4 a.m. to vote on removing my father as CEO. The vote had been unanimous. There were photos of my parents being led out of the hotel. My father looked broken, a man whose soul had been extracted. My mother looked furious, her eyes scanning the crowd for a savior who wasn't there. And there was a photo of me, standing on the stage, the microphone in my hand. The caption simply read, "The Whistleblower." I put the phone down and made coffee. I drank it black, staring at the wall, feeling a strange sense of dislocation. I was unemployed, disowned, and infamous, or so I thought. 2 days later, I put on my best blazer, not one my mother had bought, but one I had thrifted and tailored myself, and drove to the offices of Veritas Audit Solutions. The moment I swiped my badge at the turnstile, the chatter in the lobby died. Heads turned, eyes followed me. These were forensic accountants, people trained to look for details, and they were dissecting me. I kept my chin up, clutching my briefcase, and walked straight to the elevator. I expected a cardboard box. I expected a meeting with HR where they would tell me that I was too much of a distraction and hand me a severance check. Instead, when I reached my floor, the managing partner, Mr. Henderson, was waiting by my desk. Henderson was a man of few words and even fewer emotions. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. The office was deadly silent. My coworkers were pretending to type, but I knew they were listening. "Tessa," Henderson said. "Mr. Henderson," I replied, bracing myself. "If this is about my termination, I would like to request that we do it in private." "Termination." He frowned, looking genuinely confused. Why on earth would I fire the only person in this building who knows how to do their job? He gestured to my computer. "You brought down a Fortune 500 company with a spreadsheet," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "You spotted a wash scheme that 3 other external audit firms missed. That is not grounds for termination. Ms. Bracken, that is a case study." He dropped a file on my desk. "We are promoting you to senior lead analyst," he said. "You will be heading the fraud detection unit for the new tech sector accounts. It comes with a 30% raise and a corner office. Try not to cause any more federal raids before lunch." He turned and walked away. For a second, I stood there, stunned. Then, a slow applause started. It wasn't the polite, terrified applause of the gilded cage. It was genuine. My colleague, Mike, grinned and gave me a thumbs up. I sat down in my chair, the leather squeaking beneath me, and opened the file. I was not a pariah. I was a professional. But the ghosts of the Bracken house were not exorcised so easily. The following week, a courier arrived at my apartment with a thick envelope. It was on the letterhead of the city's most expensive criminal defense firm. My parents had retained counsel. I opened the letter with a kitchen knife. It was a cease and desist order, threatening a defamation lawsuit if I spoke to the press, spoke to the authorities, or continued to disparage the reputation of Richard and Victoria Bracken. It demanded I retract my statements and sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for them not suing me for emotional distress. I read it twice. In the past, this letter would have sent me into a panic attack. I would have called them, crying, begging for forgiveness. I would have believed that they had the power to crush me. But as I looked at the signature at the bottom, I realized something. This letter was sent from a desperate lawyer trying to justify his retainer to clients who were currently sitting in a federal detention center without bail. They had no leverage. They had no reputation left to disparage. I walked over to my shredder. I fed the letter into the machine. I watched as the heavy cream-colored paper was sliced into confetti. "Sue me," I said to the empty room. "I know where the rest of the bodies are buried." That afternoon, I opened my closet. It was filled with clothes that did not belong to me. There were silk blouses in pastel colors that washed me out. There were stiff, structural dresses that made it hard to breathe. There were designer handbags, a Birkin, a Kelly, a Chanel flat bag that my mother had forced on me as investments, but which I was never allowed to use because I might scratch them. They were totems of her control. Every time I looked at them, I saw her critical eye. I saw the way she would pinch the fabric at my waist and tell me to skip dinner. I pulled them all out. I piled them onto my bed until it looked like a dragon's hoard of luxury goods. I spent the next 3 days photographing them and listing them on an auction site. The bidding was fierce. The provenance of the items from the collection of the Bracken heiress drove the prices up. When the last item was sold, the total came to $140,000. It was enough money to buy a new car, to put a down payment on a house, to travel the world. I did not keep a cent. I wrote a check for the entire amount to the Safe Harbor Coalition, a nonprofit that provided legal aid and housing for victims of domestic and financial abuse. When I dropped the envelope in the mailbox, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had taken the symbols of my oppression and turned them into keys for someone else's freedom. A few days later, My phone buzzed with a call from a number I did not recognize. It was Arthur Harrison. "Miss Bracken," his gravelly voice came through the line. "I trust you are still standing." "I am Mr. Harrison," I said, smiling. "Although I am a little lighter on luggage." "Good," he said. "Listen, I am an old man, and I do not like eating alone. Meet me at the diner on 4th Street, noon. Do not wear a suit." I met him. He was sitting in a booth, eating a slice of cherry pie. He looked out of place in the greasy spoon, yet entirely comfortable. We talked for 2 hours. He did not ask about the scandal. He did not ask about my parents. He asked me about the audit. He asked me about the specific algorithms I had used to trace the shell companies. He asked me about my views on the current regulatory landscape. "You have a sharp mind, Tessa," he said, wiping a crumb from his lip. "Sharper than your father's ever was. He was a blunt instrument. You are a scalpel." "Thank you," I said. "I meant what I said at the party," he continued. "I am retiring in 2 years. I have a board full of yes-men and nephews who think they deserve my chair. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I am wrong. I want you to join my advisory board. It is a mentorship position. You keep your job at Veritas, but you learn how to run a company the right way." I looked at him. This was the man my father had spent a lifetime demonizing, and here he was, offering me a seat at the table simply because he respected my work. "I would be honored," I said. "Good," he grunted. "Now eat your fries. You look like you haven't eaten a carb since the Clinton administration." The final step of my exorcism happened on a rainy Tuesday. I walked into a salon in the city center. I sat in the chair and looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was long, blonde, and highlighted to perfection the bracken blonde my mother insisted upon. It was high maintenance, expensive, and not me. "What are we doing today?" the stylist asked. "Cut it," I said. "Trim." "No," I said. "Cut it off. All of it." I watched as the long, heavy strands fell to the floor. With every snip of the scissors, I felt like I was shedding a layer of skin. When the stylist was done, I looked at the stranger in the mirror. She had a sharp, angled bob that barely grazed her chin. It was dark, my natural color, a rich chestnut brown that I hadn't seen since I was 14. I left the salon and walked into a boutique. I bought a leather jacket. I bought a pair of combat boots. I bought a dress that was bright. Violent orange, a color my mother hated. I walked down the street, catching my reflection in the shop windows. I didn't look like a porcelain doll anymore. I looked like a woman who could handle herself in a fight. That night, I sat on my fire escape, looking out at the city lights. The air was cold, but I didn't mind. I thought about the scar on my heart. It was still there. The betrayal. The pain of knowing my parents chose money over me that didn't just go away because I won. It was a deep, jagged wound, but wounds heal. They knit together. They become tough, fibrous tissue that is stronger than the skin that was there before. I ran my hand over the rough brick of the building. I was 28 years old. I had no inheritance. I had no family estate. But I had a job I earned. I had a mentor who respected me. I had a family of choice who stood by me. And I had the truth. I was not just a survivor of the Bracken House. I was the one who burned it down so I could build something better in the ashes. And as I watched the city sleep, I realized that for the first time in my life, the story being written was finally, truly mine. It had been exactly 7 days since the chandeliers of the gilded cage shook with the force of my revelation. 1 week since the sirens drowned out the string quartet. 1 week since I watched my parents being shoved into the back of federal vehicles like common criminals. Tonight was the 7th of the month. It was the actual anniversary of the day I was born, not the convenient date my mother had chosen for her social calendar. I was not at a 5-star hotel. I was at a place called Benny's Burger Shack, a roadside dive located under the rattling tracks of the elevated train line. The neon sign outside buzzed with a dying electrical hum. Flickering between Benny's and Ben's, The air inside smelled of old fryer grease, onions, and floor cleaner. To most people, it was a health code violation waiting to happen. To me, it was sanctuary. I sat in a red vinyl booth that was held together with duct tape. Across from me sat the only 3 people in the world I wanted to see. There was Sarah, my cousin who had stood as a human shield against my father. There was Mike, the forensic analyst from work who had helped me decrypt the final batch of files. And there was Uncle Ben, who was currently wrestling with a double bacon cheeseburger the size of his head. And sitting on the bench next to me in his travel carrier was Barnaby, my one-eyed rescue cat. The owner of the shack, a man named Sal, who had known me since I was a broke college student. Didn't mind cats. He said Barnaby had more manners than half the customers who walked through the door. "To the birthday girl," Mike said, raising a milkshake glass. "And to the most effective corporate takedown in the history of the Eastern Seaboard." "To freedom," Sarah added, clinking her soda bottle against his glass. "To bacon," Uncle Ben mumbled with his mouth full. I smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached my eyes. I was wearing a hoodie and jeans. I wasn't wearing makeup. I was eating a burger that cost $8.50, and it tasted better than the lobster thermidor I had been denied a week ago. "Open the mail," Sarah nudged me, pointing to the thick manila envelope sitting on the sticky table. I wiped the grease from my hands and picked it up. It bore the seal of the New York State Family Court. I tore the tab and slid the documents out. Permanent order of protection. The judge had signed it that morning. Richard and Victoria Bracken were legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me, contacting me, or having third parties contact me, for the rest of their natural lives, given that they were currently being held without bail at a federal detention center pending trial. The physical distance was guaranteed, but the legal weight of the paper felt like a shield. "It is official," I said, placing the paper on the table. "I am legally an orphan, and I have never been happier." "You are not an orphan," Uncle Ben said, wiping ketchup from his chin. "You just trimmed the dead branches off the family tree. The roots are still here." I felt a lump in my throat. I reached out and squeezed his rough, calloused hand. Just then, the bell above the diner door jingled. The atmosphere in the diner shifted slightly. The regulars, mostly truck drivers and night shift nurses, looked up. Walking through the door was a man who looked entirely out of place at Benny's. He was wearing a charcoal wool coat, a silk scarf, and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than the entire kitchen equipment. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with silver hair combed back severely. He scanned the room, ignoring the stairs, until his eyes landed on our booth. He walked toward us. I tensed up. My first instinct was that this was one of my parents' lawyers, here to deliver another threat. Uncle Ben started to rise, his protective instinct flaring up, but I put a hand on his arm to stop him. The man stopped at our table. He looked at the burger baskets, the milkshake, and the cat carrier. A small, dry smile touched his lips. "Tessa Bracken?" he asked. His voice was like dry parchment. "Who is asking?" I replied, my guard up. "My name is Arthur Thorne," he said. "I was the personal attorney for your grandmother, Rose Bracken, for 40 years. I blinked. Grandma Rose had died when I was 10. She was the only person in that house who had ever hugged me without checking to see if I wrinkled her dress first. "My grandmother has been dead for 18 years, I said. "She has..." "Mr. Thorne agreed. "May I sit? This concerns a matter she entrusted to me with very specific instructions." I slid over. Making room. Sarah and Mike exchanged worried glances. "Mr. Thorne placed his briefcase on the table, pushing aside a basket of onion rings. He clicked the latches open. "Your grandmother was a very observant woman," Thorne began. "She knew her son, your father, better than anyone. She knew he was greedy. She knew he was controlling. And she worried about you." He pulled out a document that looked yellowed with age. "When Rose passed, the reading of the will was a standard affair. Richard inherited the estate. You know this. But there was a codicil. A secret trust." "A trust?" I frowned. My parents told me she left me nothing. They lied, Thorne said simply. Or rather, they did not tell you the whole truth because they could not access it. Rose left a trust fund in your name, but she placed a very specific, ironclad condition on its release. He slid the document toward me, pointing to a paragraph in the middle. The funds, Thorne read aloud, are to be held in blind trust, accumulating interest, until such a time that my granddaughter, Tessa Bracken, is completely and publicly severed from the control of her father, Richard Bracken. This severance must be initiated by Richard himself, in a public forum, ensuring that he has no legal claim over her or her assets. I stared at the words, completely and publicly severed, initiated by Richard himself. Rose knew that if she gave you the money while you were under his roof, he would take it. Thorne explained. She knew he would bully you into signing it over to the company, so she created a poison pill. The only way for the money to be released to you was for Richard to throw you away. I felt a chill run down my spine. My grandmother, that quiet woman who used to sneak me cookies, had played a long game from the grave. She had set a trap that took 18 years to spring. My father disowned me on a live stream, I whispered. He projected the legal notice on a 20-foot screen. I know, Thorne said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. I watched it. It was legally binding, and by declaring you disowned and stripped of all family ties, he satisfied the exact conditions of Rose's will. He proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he has no influence over you. Thorne reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a cashier's check. Richard and Victoria spent 20 years trying to find a loophole to get this money, Thorne said. They tried to certify you incompetent. They tried to sue the estate, but the clause held, and in their arrogance, in their desire to hurt you last week, they handed you the key. He placed the check on the table. Right next to my half-eaten burger, I looked at the number. I had to blink to make sure I was seeing it correctly. I counted the zeros. $25,400,000.00. The silence in the booth was deafening. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth. Uncle Ben dropped an onion ring. 25 million, I breathed. Rose was a very savvy investor, Thorne said, closing his briefcase. It was 5 million when she died. The market has been kind. I sat back against the duct-taped vinyl. I started to laugh. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a deep, guttural laugh of pure absurdity. My parents had staged a $200,000 party to ruin me. They had tried to strip me of a $50,000 education fund, and by doing so, they had unlocked a fortune that was 500 times larger. Their cruelty was my payday. It is yours, Tessa, Thorne said, standing up, free and clear, no strings, no parents, just you. Thank you, I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. He tipped his hat and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the night like a fairy godfather in a wool coat. I looked at the check. Then I looked at Mike. Mike, I said, how much is the buy-in for a partnership stake at Veritas? Mike choked on his milkshake. For a junior partner, maybe 200,000. For a senior equity partner, a couple million. Good, I said, tapping the check with my fingernail. I am not just going back to work on Monday as an analyst. I am going back as an owner. You are going to buy the company? Sarah asked, her eyes wide. I am going to buy a seat at the table, I corrected. I am going to make sure that Veritas becomes the nightmare of every corrupt corporate dynasty in this country. I am going to build a department dedicated to finding people like me the scapegoats, the silences, and giving them a voice. I picked up the check and slipped it into my pocket, right next to the restraining order. But first, I said, signaling to Sal behind the counter, we need dessert. Sal brought out a single cupcake. It wasn't fancy. It was chocolate with a messy swirl of vanilla frosting and one bright pink candle stuck in the middle. Happy birthday, Tessa, Sarah whispered. Make a wish, Uncle Ben said. I looked at the flame flickering in the drafty air of the diner. I thought about wishes, for years, I had wished to be loved. I had wished to be accepted. I had wished to be good enough for the gilded cage. I didn't need to wish for those things anymore. I was loved by the people at this table. I was accepted by the only person who mattered, myself. And the gilded cage was a crime scene. I didn't have a wish. I had a plan. I looked directly into the lens of the camera, breaking the invisible barrier between my world and yours. I looked at you, the witness to my story. They wanted to erase my name, I said, my voice steady and low. They thought if they took away my inheritance, my reputation, and my family, I would disappear. But they forgot one fundamental rule of life. You cannot erase the author of the story. I leaned in closer to the flame. And I am just starting to write the second chapter. I blew out the candle. Smoke curled up, smelling of burnt wax and victory. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and picked up Barnaby's carrier. I threw a $100 bill on the table for Sal, a tip for the best birthday dinner of my life. "Let's go," I said to my team. I pushed open the door of Benny's Burger Shack and stepped out. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean. The city of New York lay before me, a grid of lights and possibilities. I walked onto the sidewalk, my boots clicking on the pavement with a heavy, purposeful rhythm. I wasn't just Tessa the victim anymore. I wasn't just Tessa the whistleblower. I was Tessa Bracken, the woman who walked through fire and came out holding the torch. I was free. I was wealthy. And as I merged into the stream of people flowing through the city streets, invisible yet invincible, I knew one thing for certain. I was dangerous. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey from that stage at the gilded cage to this moment of freedom, and I am so glad you were here to witness it with me. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy city like New York, or somewhere quiet and peaceful? Please leave a comment below and let me know your location and what you would do if you were in my shoes. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please make sure to subscribe to the Sunday Drama Stories channel. Hit that like button to support the video, and press the hype button so this story can reach even more people who need to hear that the truth always wins. See you in the next story.